Hi everyone, I just wanted to come on and do a roundup class, basically. Hopefully a short class that will inspire you to look back over the last 15 classes and maybe do some revision. I'm basically going to talk about some of my favorite works of art that we've already looked at, like some of my highlights from the 15 classes, and hopefully you can do the same, like pick your own favorites. I think that would be a really nice idea. So the first one of my favorite class is on the screen now. It's quite predictable, I suppose. We did this in a very recent TC Canon class. I love this painting. You have to go and see it in real life. It's huge and the colors are just unreal. And this was from the TC Canon class. It's called the Cloud Madonna. And doing this kind of roundup class has been a good exercise for me because I've noticed recurring themes. I think we've talked a lot about alternative paintings of Christian subjects. I really like religious paintings that try and do something different, maybe that try to de-Westernize Christianity. I find them super, super interesting. And I like that this painting is obviously a native take on the Virgin Mary, keeping her traditional blue veil, but portraying her in this completely different light. So I really like it. The next favorite in my personal roundup is Damien Hurst's Fragility of Love. This one was super unusual. It's not like me to have a conceptual work as a favorite, but I mentioned this in the conceptual art class as something that I thought just really captured an emotion that is really difficult to put into words, like being excited about something but at the same time fearful that it could end at any moment. It's not an emotion that you can really, there's not really a word that exists for it in English, but I feel like this is a kind of a really good example of that. I wanted to also include a favorite abstract painting because there aren't many in my collection of favorite paintings from this class. I'm not a massive abstract painting person because I normally like more political stuff. But this one, which was from one of the feminism classes, is just, yeah, one of my favorites. This unfortunately is a terrible reproduction, but there's something about this painting that is just surreal for me. Yeah, and I don't know why it speaks to me so much. And I think that's something that I wanted to stress, is that sometimes you like something for no reason, and it's quite nice to put that in your own roundup of favorite things from this class. The next work of art in my roundup has to be one of my favorite works of art of all time. I think it's so effective. This was also from the feminism class, and it's a conceptual work, a wooden ironing board with a slave ship, a diagram of a slave ship pasted on top of it. The iron is chained to the ironing board, and I just find it so effective, and it's telling a very complicated message, because one of the principal arguments of the African American feminist movement is that this stereotype of white women being housewives that they're trying to break free from is something that we've never had the luxury of experiencing, because Black women were never allowed the luxury of being stereotyped as housewives because of their historical relation to slave labor. And it really makes you realize that we have to understand people's different contexts when we talk about feminism. So I find this a super, super powerful work. I remember when I showed this, actually, one of you in the class said that you would prefer it without the KKK in the background in order to kind of allow the viewer to come to the conclusion themselves, which I thought was really interesting, and maybe something that people might not have spotted, this KKK detail in the background. Speaking of African American artists, I actually I tried not to include Kehinde Wiley, honestly, because I've mentioned him, I might even say, in every single class. But I love his paintings. I love how he puts Black men into traditionally Renaissance white women compositions and challenges these stereotypes about, you know, hard and harsh Black masculinity by really feminizing his figures. I love them. And this gives you a sense of their scale. Obviously, I seem to be obsessed with large paintings. It's personal. Some people really love miniatures. However, this is not the painting that I wanted to include. If I had to pick one by an African-American artist from this whole course that we've looked at, it would be this one by Titus Kaphar. I just think I like how literal it is. I think some things we can be literal about, and some things are more powerful to kind of be obvious about. And I love that this is basically saying that the United States was built on the backs of Black women. And I just think it's, even though the message is so like tragic, it manages also to be a really beautiful painting, looking back to kind of to so many different times in art history where these really realistic, super skilled artists were flourishing. I just love this painting. And it's massive as well. It's really, really, really big. Next on the list, actually, I just wanted to continue the theme of portraiture, I guess, because this is another thing that emerged for me as I was making this class. It's become clear to me that I really love portraiture. And I hope when you do your own exercise like this, looking back over the classes, you find a kind of genre that seems to speak to you more than others. I love portraiture. And this series, which I mentioned briefly at the end of the portraiture class, is one of the most beautiful for me. It's a contemporary artist, and he basically interviewed Holocaust survivors while filming them and painting them at the same time, 3 things in one. And something unique about this artist is that they only paint in one sitting, even though they produce these extremely realist works of art, like the ones I was just mentioning. They're only made in one sitting. And it's just so beautiful because at the end of the video, you see that he shows the sitter their painting and you get to see their reaction. And by listening to the interviews, which you can find on YouTube, you learn so much about Holocaust history and family trauma. And it's just such a beautiful, effective way to record history in which I feel like everyone wins, you know, the artist, the participant, the viewers. I find it so powerful. I really, really love this series of portraits. This is a portrait that one of you sent me as one of your favorites to include in this roundup, which made me realize that I haven't done a single class, I think, on anything British. So that is potentially to come. And it's interesting also to do this roundup and see if you have any geographical favorites that keep coming up and up. But staying on the theme of portraiture, actually, one thing I did mention in the classes is that Rembrandt is probably one of my favorite traditionally respected artists. Someone suggested that I do a class on famous artists who are quote unquote worth the hype, which I think would be a really good idea. And Rembrandt is one of those artists, I think. On the right-hand side, I've included a picture of the Frick Museum, the Frick Collection in New York, which is a beautiful museum. And they have a Rembrandt in this gallery of other artists. And I think seeing a Rembrandt outside of the context of other Rembrandt paintings makes you realize that in a gallery of artists, he totally stands out. Like, I don't know why, but his portrait tells you so much more about the sitter than any other portrait in the room. So I think Rembrandt is one of those artists who's, yeah, definitely worth the hype. And the other artist like that I wanted to mention that maybe I would put in this class as well is Jan van Eyck. I just think you know, I mean, this painting is so famous. It's in the National Gallery. I've talked about it in many classes, actually, because it fits into so many themes. And I just think his paintings are like, you know, a gift that keeps on giving. Every single detail tells you something new. The Passion of Christ is painted around the mirror. I've said it a million times. I won't go on about this painting. And it's, you know, he paints himself in. So it's like, you know, the first selfie of all time. I think you've probably heard me talk about this painting too much, but this is one of my favorites. Again, one to see in person in the National Gallery in London, and definitely worth the hype. Staying on the theme of favorite artists who are worth the hype, this painting that we looked at, I can't remember in which class, maybe it was also the portraiture class, is unreal. It's the painting on the wall of the Sistine Chapel, so it's not on the more famous ceiling, but it's still in the same room as the kind of famous Sistine Chapel moment. And what I love about this is that Michelangelo paints himself into the portrait, but instead of painting himself in a traditional manner, he paints St. Bartholomew, the saintly figure who notoriously flayed himself, like flayed his skin, I don't know how you say it, removed his skin. And he's often characterized because he's holding a knife. So he paints St. Bartholomew, and he paints him holding his skin. But instead of painting St. Bartholomew's face, he actually paints his self-portrait into the skin of St. Bartholomew, which is just unreal. I mean, you can see that it's not the same person. So this is St. Bartholomew and this is Michelangelo. And I think it just says so much about Michelangelo's self-perception. He was a really, really depressed figure who felt like he could never work enough. He was a kind of tortured soul. And it's really captured for me in this painting. He never finished so many of his artworks, and it just tormented him. And I've never seen such an evocative self-representation and something so modern and surrealist. I mean, it's so imaginative. And for someone who was so obsessed with filling out the body and painting muscles and strength, to paint themselves like this is just like shocking and so powerful. Before I move on to my personal favorites that I haven't included in the class so far, I wanted to go back and mention one of my favorite buildings that we've talked about, and it has to be San Juan Chamula in Mexico. This was included in the second architecture class, where we basically talked about colonial architecture and how the Spanish, when they arrived, they were faced with these two different civilizations, the Aztecs and the Mayans. And the Aztecs built these recognizable staircase-like temples, in the non-fancy way of saying it. And the Spanish responded by building cathedrals on top of them. And that was how they, managed to represent their power, because the Aztecs would typically show a new ruler by adding a layer onto the temples, which is how they end up being so big. And so the Spanish added their own definitive layer and built over all of the temples, which is absolutely tragic. And actually now in Mexico City, they've put glass around the Spanish cathedral in the city center so that you can see the temple beneath. So absolutely shocking. But this cathedral that you're looking at is in the south, which means they were faced with the Mayan civilization, who worshipped very differently. They worshipped in caves, actually. In this particular community, San Juan Chamula. And so the Spanish found that even when they were building cathedrals, this particular community were not interested in worshipping there. It was too unusual for them. So what they did is extremely tragically blocked off all the caves and tried to make the inside of this church look as cave-like as possible. It's very dark in there. It's covered in ferns. You're not allowed to take pictures, actually, because of the Mayan religion's relationship with reflections as this dangerous thing that slips you into a kind of underworld and makes you become ill. So there's no photographs. And basically what happened when this was built is that you ended up with this fusion of Catholicism and traditional Mayan religious rituals. And actually you can see that this doorway is covered in Mayan symbols, and it's just so interesting. I'm not even sure you can call it a fusion. There are Catholic saints inside, but the Mayan people really stayed in this community, stayed really true to their religious rituals. So, which included sacrifice, and it's said, because they continue to sacrifice chickens in this church, and it's said that that's because the Spanish actually brought chickens over, so it's kind of a metaphor. So there are so many interesting things about this piece of architecture, aside from the fact that it's absolutely beautiful. So I had to include it as a favorite. I'm going to briefly mention an object. This is an object that we haven't had a chance to talk about at all in this class. It deserves a class of its own, but I just wanted to use this opportunity to include something new and a random favorite for a future class. This is an object called Tipu's tiger, and it represents Tipu Sultan, who I'm going to read you an excerpt about now. So Tipu Sultan was the ruler of the kingdom of Mysore, based in South India. He deployed rockets against the advances of British forces in the 18th century. So he was a leader in many of the Anglo-Mysore wars. He also embarked on an ambitious economic development program that established Mysore as a major economic power with some of the world's highest real wages and living standards in the late 18th century. So basically, Tipu was an 18th century ruler who was like an absolutely fierce enemy for the British. They had destroyed much of the Mughal Empire, and they could not get down into the south past this ruler. And he was actually only defeated in the Fourth Anglo-Mysorean War in 1799. So what an amazing historical figure. He's just unreal. And he's actually always represented by tiger stripes. He was obsessed with them. His army all wore tiger stripes, and he owned loads of tiger-like objects. And so immediately you can see that this is not just a representation of a tiger devouring a man. It's a representation of Tipu Sultan devouring a white European. So it's such a political work, and it's also really comical, which is, I mean, enhanced by the fact that if you pull this lever, there's actually is it called an organ inside that makes groaning noises as if the European is dying. So it's a super surrealist. I mean, this could have been made by the surrealists in the 20th century. So it's a super, super, super funny and like political and critical work. So I love it. And amazingly, it's actually in the V&A in London, which is unreal. So you can go and see it. And if you click on this link on the PDF, the V&A actually have a video about the person who was responsible for its restoration. I wanted to include an object like this because I think when someone asks you what your favorite work of art is, it's easy to jump to a painting, but there are actually super interesting objects out there. And I mean, we could do a whole class on objects actually. But yeah, I found this object, Tipu's tiger, in a book that one of you very kindly lent me, which during this year that there have been no exhibitions, these kind of art history books have been my main source of finding new works of art that I love. So this is definitely my favorite discovery of the year. This book also had amazing examples of Mughal copies of European engravings. We talked a lot about Jahangir in the 16th and 17th centuries in the Mughal Empire, so now talking about the northern part of India, and how he was a super international ruler who loved the history of art across all continents and sent lots of artists to make these copies of European paintings. And I just find again, it's the same theme that I was talking about in the very first slide of this class. These different, you know, more unusual, less talked about representations of religion I find so interesting. And especially in this example, you can see that the artist is copying from a black and white engraving because they've had to take their own liberty with the colors, and you end up with these amazing like yellow and blue color combinations. So yeah, I absolutely really loved this work of art as well. And this is Jahangir, who, as I said, we've already talked about in, I think this was the class on portraiture. This is definitely what we're looking at now, is one of the most interesting portraits of all time. But I will let you go back to the class and learn why. And speaking of, you know, alternative representations of Catholicism, I obviously had to include the feather paintings that we looked at in the class on Mexican art, because these are absolutely unreal. And the Spanish actually asked Aztecs, Aztec feather workers to make these Catholic feather works for them, because they were so blown away by like the talent that they had in feather work. And I think it's interesting to see the difference between an emperor who copied European engravings by choice and a civilization that was forced to. So you always have to keep that in mind. Something that I'm going to talk about in the future is this flag in New Zealand, which is a Maori interpretation of Christianity that I'm still trying to find more information about, but it was included in the Royal Academy's Oceania exhibition, and it's, I remember it was so interesting. I'm dying to find out more. So as soon as I get my hands on the catalogue, we'll have to delve into the region in general, but also how they coped with the imposition of religion and colonialism, which has come up countless times in this course. Just to end on something a little bit different, I suppose, coming to the end, this is one that I haven't included. I could have included this in my class on classical sculpture, which we looked at. This colossal head is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's one of the first things that you see. I've tried to include a picture of where and how it's placed, because you can really see it all the way down the corridor. And it's just stunning. Like, it's so, I've never forgotten seeing this work of art, and a picture doesn't do it justice. And I love the way that it's broken in a perfect diagonal. It's so old, but it looks so modern. And there's something about broken works of art for me that I find really interesting. Like, they don't just have their own history in and of themselves. They also contain the history of the moment that they were broken. You know, like, works of art are always broken for a reason, whether it's just the passing of time. And actually, we touched upon that in the class, maybe the first or second class on architecture, when we talked about the not underground, but rock-cut Hindu temples that were later, you know, attempted to be destroyed by one Mughal emperor. So super interesting, super interesting. The final work to discuss is a work that will hopefully prompt you to look back at the Renaissance class, because this is one of my favorite works of art in the Renaissance. It's just beautiful. The architecture, the symbolism, the birds, the lion in the background, the perspective on the floor, the fact that the artist is really showing off how well they can paint textures by doing this marble frame, which is completely illusionistic. And actually, the person in this painting is St. Jerome, who is, in theory, you know, one of the most revered scholars of all time. You know, and yet he's represented in this quite like sparse library with very few books. And someone once said to me that this really represents the fact that the Renaissance man was deemed to be intelligent if they read very few books but very well. And I think there's something so nice about that in this current culture where we're just encouraged to consume book after book after book. There's something quite calming about the thought of just like having very few. And And it's the same with works of art. Like, it's better to spend more time looking at one and really learning everything there is to learn than looking at hundreds, which is a lesson that I'm still learning, quite obviously. So yeah, this is my collection of favorites. This is a contemporary favorite that is a photography project that I also just find beautiful, just for no reason. There's something about this. Some of which I've included in the class before, some of which I've never spoken about before, but this is a really nice exercise to do, like to think about the favorites in the class and then make a list of your own favorites that you would like to be included and send them to me. It's a super nice way to revise, and